welcome to the best practices class, the third advanced class. That's a little bit my catch-all for a bunch of different things that I picked up over the years. What are we going to do today? Well, my primary goal is to get you guys familiar with some of the more advanced features that REDCap offers, that we offer in conjunction with the UW, and some best practices on how to best design a form, what you can do with variables, study design in general, and what you should and should not do with surveys. And finally, I added a little bit of this one, so you guys have a first here, the data quality module. There's various data quality tools that I've noticed that people really like to use. However, they're a little bit esoteric, so they need explanation. Well, REDCap offers some form of randomization. It's actually not true randomization, because you still need to have an allocation table be generated outside of REDCap. So there's no random number generator within REDCap that says, okay, you are now in group 4. There's a button that mimics that when you have an allocation table set up properly. So if you want to use randomization in REDCap, you always have to go to do some other things. REDCap does offer some stratified randomization, so if you want to split it up in groups, you can randomize by group and or site, and you can define the user rights for randomization, basically who can randomize and who can see all the randomizations in the normal user rights window. So if you are looking for that, REDCap does offer that. However, there are a couple things you need to do. So first, you have to activate the randomization feature, select your options and randomization field in the randomization application. It has a bunch of text that basically steps you through the entire process. So if you need help, just read the text, otherwise email me. You create the randomization field on the first form. This has to be a separate variable that has a bunch of different options, basically your whatever number of randomization groups you have. If it's an existing variable, that variable gets overwritten with the randomization data. So I highly advise people to create a specific randomization variable. Set up the allocation tables. If you have no experience with allocation tables, contact a biostatistician. They do this for a living. They live for that kind of stuff. So do that. You have to set up 2 of them, one for development and one for production. Why that is, I can't tell you. That's just the way they set it up. However, you do have to upload one. You can upload the same one for each one. After that, you have to define your user rights, basically who can randomize, who can see it. Start data collection and randomize, and of course monitor the randomization process. That's the quick and dirty version. So because this is a long list and not super easy to use, we only have 2 people out of 2,200 people use it. So, however, it is an advanced feature that some people are interested in, so if you want to use it, it's free and you can use it. The REDCap Amalga Bridge. REDCap Amalga Bridge is a really interesting feature that if you do a lot of work with electronic medical records, it can save you a ton of time. So Amalga is the clinical data warehouse for UW Medicine. Basically, it's a very big database that collects all the data from the outpatient clinics, the inpatient clinics, labs, ADT, which stands for admission, discharge, and transfer, which is kind of the hotel function of hospital, and I think about 50 or 60 other minor clinical systems that are specific to the departments. So this all gets gathered in one big database, which is huge. I think they have like 80 million records at this point. And it gets basically processed and put into the right tables. So because of that, it's not instantaneous. So you cannot say, okay, I want to query Amalga for all the people that came in the last minute with this specific diagnosis. However, if you do that a week from now, saying like, give me all the people that came in on Tuesday the 10th with that diagnosis, Amalga can probably tell you that. So usually within a week, the data is fairly complete. However, the closer you are to real time, the less complete it gets, obviously. So because of this, is really great for retrospective studies or for studies that are not super time sensitive. It does require an AMC account, which basically means that you need to be a UW Medicine employee and have to be vetted by them. And because of this, there are very strict access policies. So because it's a ginormous database with so much data and like a million different tables, it's fairly hard to basically get around in, especially if you don't know how to construct a query in SQL. If you do, then still you need about 2-3 hours to familiarize yourself with just the data structure of the thing. So as a result, they don't give that access to everybody. However, they do have a solution for that. It's called the DCDR, or the De-Identified Clinical Data Repository. It's something that the ITHS set up, and it will allow you to log in, and with a very simple class, I think they have a video of it now, you can basically scour or skewer, or whatever the phrase is, the data warehouse for certain subsets of patients. For instance, if you want to know how many African American left-handed guys with diabetes in the age bracket of 35 or 45 are, you can use the DCDR to get a count. So you cannot get actually patient data, you can just get counts of how many people they have, and at that point we can convert that count or that query that you built into an actual data set with patient data. And that's where REDCap comes in. So REDCap will allow you to import that clinical data from the data warehouse directly into a REDCap project. So you can do this either on a one-time basis, just give me all the people from the last 2 years that meet this certain criteria. Or you can do it continuously, saying, okay, give me all the people that entered the hospital with diabetes in the last day, and run that report every day, so you add new records. You can also go the other way, import REDCap data into Amelga. So you can either use that as source data for one of those queries. For instance, if you want to get information about a certain person and want to run that through the query, instead of having to email us saying, okay, can you pull this data for me? We can set up a certain structure that you put in that patient's MRN, and then after it runs, you get the data back into another REDCap project. You can also use the Amelga system to generate a little bit more of a custom report. For instance, if you want to do trend charts or something similar to that, which isn't really possible with the report builder at this point in REDCap, you can use Amelga to do that. And if you want to get really fancy with some advanced calculations or stuff you want to do on a regular basis, then you can also do that in Amelga. So two very important notes on this one. You should have an IRB in place for this one, because you are dealing with medical data, PHI and such, and if you don't have IRB in place, the government gets mad at you and you can go to jail and all kinds of other nasty things happen. So have that in place, and it does require some development time from the BMI consult team. So they have access, they do nothing else all day, writing queries similar to this. If you tell them, like, I want these kind of people, they can usually pretty quickly tell you, okay, that will take us 5 hours to pull for you, or this will take us 10 hours to set up. Or if you have the DCDR thing, it's like, oh, you're just going to use your own query that you already built and give you the data set once we see an IRB. So that's kind of handy. So you do need those two things before you can access this. However, it gets really useful. So this is one of the reporting examples which we built for a cardiologist. He collected about 500 variables in his study. However, 500 variables was a little bit much to take in all at once, so he wanted to have a custom report of, I think, 40 of the most important variables and have them displayed in various ways. So what we did is every night, 1 o'clock at night, we pulled that data from his REDCap project into, it's called a custom C# library. However, that's basically the interface we use between REDCap and Amelga, and basically use that information to generate a secure report that only he could see. So really simple way of utilizing that link between the two systems and augmenting basically your data capture abilities with generating reports. One that was a little bit more complex was this one. It was and this was a really interesting one. It was actually our very first project we did to actually have a proof of concept with this one. And the story behind this was that somebody was doing a retrospective study of about 5,000 women over a 3,003-year period, where they were doing chart abstractions to their reproductive preventative methods, in this case a little spiral. So what they were doing is they were hiring 4 med students to scour the EMR to look up this data and enter it into REDCap, which was very labor intensive and wasn't very efficient. They basically did about, I think, 200 people in 4 months' time with 4 people. So if you extrapolate that, it would take them years to get all that data out of there. So we came in and we said, well, we can probably do it quicker. We spent about a month and a half getting the query up and running and building this interface and coming up with this data model. And we kind of imported about 70% of the data from Amelga into REDCap that they needed. The other 30% was clinical notes. So a lot of information is in clinical notes, so it's not structured, so it's harder to find. But we did import those clinical notes. So the only thing they had to do, instead of going into the EMR and finding the data and copying it, they would go into REDCap, go into the clinical notes, extract the data from there, and then put it into variables underneath there. So only one system. Greatly sped up their process, probably saved them years of data entry. So how it would work, the IRB was very strict about this. They wanted a separate identity database versus the actual database, so they could basically delete the identifiers after they got their study data. So we set up 2 different REDCap projects, an identifier database obviously, which pushed a bunch of data into the Amelga system, which we used it for the query. We made the query, got 5,000 people's worth of data back, and shot that into the study database, de-identified. So that's kind of nice. So this took, I think, 10 minutes to run. It took about a month and a half to develop, but then 10 minutes to run. So they could run it over and over when they got new people to add to their study. So this is something we could do for you. If you have data in your in the UW system, you could potentially get that out of there fairly easily and quickly for a fraction of the cost if you were to have to hire people to actually do the manual data abstraction for you. So it's a little bit of an advanced feature that's unique to the UW. It is unique to the UW. So if you're from Children's, I don't know if anybody here is from Children's, but if you're from Children's, we actually don't have a link to their data warehouse, so we cannot port it over. They're fairly strict with IT. Moving on to the dynamic SQL link. The dynamic SQL link is a little bit harder to explain, so I kind of have to teach you guys something about IT first. So in the IT world, there is a thing called a relational database. A good example of this is Access. Basically, it's a bunch of tables linked together with what they call primary keys. So for instance, if you have table 1 which has patients and you have table 2 that has, for instance, adverse events, you link the adverse event via a primary key to each individual patient. That's kind of how it works. However, REDCap's not set up that way. It's set up as an entity attribute value database, or EAV database. What it basically is one big flat file with a bunch of data in it. So it's 1 record per row, and a good example would be a single Excel spreadsheet or a REDCap project. Because of that, it's a little bit harder to basically mimic functionality you get in an Access database or a relational database, and that's where the dynamic SQL link comes in. So it's a special drop-down field that you guys won't see because it's only available to administrators, and it's populated by custom code, in this case SQL. I will have to write the code because it actually grasps on the underlying REDCap database, and it can link to either other REDCap projects, so let's say, I have examples later on, or special tables. Let's say you wanted to have a drop-down with all the UW departments, which are like 1,200 departments, then it's handier to have that in a separate table that you link to instead of actually hard coding it into the drop-down. So each drop-down field consists of a combination of a number of items. Each item has a raw value and a label. So the raw value in the label can either be a single value, can be the same single value or different, or it can be a combination of different values. For instance, if you wanted to have a study ID as the raw value, And as a label, you want somebody's date of birth and their last name, so it's easier to figure out who you're talking about. So we can do that. You can apply filters, meaning saying, give me all the people that have, for instance, this particular disease, and give that in a drop-down, or all the people that already have not been handled yet and still need to be in there. So that's the thing that you can do with SQL code. So if you are interested in that, just shoot me an email and I can build that for you. Some limitations: it's only editable by REDCap admin. The data dictionary, if you're using data dictionaries, they will not upload if you change anything about the SQL field. So changing the position, adding the label, adding the variable name, or even editing the SQL code. The main reason for that is that if you can edit that field, you could potentially look into somebody else's project, which would be a bad thing, especially if you don't have access to that project. So that's the main reason why it's only limited to admins, because they have access to all the projects anyway. So that's where the buck stops, so to speak. We charge a 200 flat fee for each link. So if you want to use a link multiple times, you can do that for just 200 bucks. It isn't $200 per link per pop. It's just like, if I have to set it up once, that's $200, and for the rest you don't have to worry about it. But I will only set it up for projects that you have access to. So if you ask a link to their projects, I say, it's not going to happen because you don't have access to that. Some examples that we've done in the past. The adverse events example that I used to explain the relational database is a good example of this. Adverse events by definition are unknown. You don't know how many adverse events each patient is going to have. So some of them are going to have 2, some of them are going to have 20, some of them are going to have none. So this is really hard to track in REDCap, because in REDCap it kind of assumes that you know how many forms or how many events you're going to capture. So this is kind of an odd duck out. So an example of using the dynamic SQL link to get around that is to have 2 projects: a main database where you collect all your other data, and a specific database for adverse events. So in the adverse event database, you have 1 record per adverse event, not per patient and then a bunch of adverse events linked to it. No, you just have 1 record per adverse event. Then you use the dynamic SQL field to link to the main database and generate a drop-down saying, okay, cool, you just entered this adverse event. Who does it belong to? So, and that list gets automatically expanded or contracted based on whether you add or delete records in the main study database. So let's say you have 20 people in your main study database, you enter number 21, and this field will automatically populate a 21th option for you. So that's kind of handy, so you don't have to recode it every single time you add somebody new. In this case, we did the raw value, the main study database, so it's easier to match later on during your analysis phase. And as a label, we did the MRN, the last name and date of birth, because that's what the research coordinators were looking for and what they knew. So a good example of how you can use a simple dynamic SQL link to get over a problem of like, yeah, I need to define 50 adverse events in my main project. So another one would be similar to what we saw with the Amelga bridge, is a project where you have an identifier database and a main database. And they want to separate the identities from the main database. So you still want the link to saying, okay, study ID 1 in the main database belongs to John Doe, which might be study ID 14 in the other database. So here you use the dynamic SQL link to do a one-on-one matching between the two, saying like, okay, this record belongs to this person in the other one. So instead of having multiple records per person, it's just one-on-one. So for this particular project, we just used the same value for both the raw value and the label, so identifier. That way they could strictly restrict access to the identity database to just a PI and think and monitor. And for the other database, the main database, there was a bunch of research coordinators and students working on that. So they safeguarded the privacy of their patients that way. So that's a really cool way of using it too. And then the final one, which is a little bit more out there, the application versus reviewer example. There was a person came to me saying like, I have a bunch of applications, and all applications have to be reviewed by 3 professors. However, it's hard to send each professor an custom invitation for in terms of a survey. So what we did is we set up 2 projects, one for the application project which had a public link that they send out to all the applicants, like fill this out if you want to apply, and one for the 3 reviewers that only the 3 reviewers had access to. In the reviewer project, in the survey itself, there was this drop down that said, okay, show me all the applications in the other project. So they could just select, okay, I want you to have person number 3 that did this application. That's the one I'm reviewing right now. So it was a little bit handier to do than custom coding it in. Raw value was the record ID for the application project, so they could easily match it later on. But for the label was a little bit interesting. We just used the last name of the applicant and the application title. However, application titles tend to be fairly long, as in long article type titles. So we limited that to 35 characters, which was usually enough to identify the application. So that way you got still a fairly compact drop-down, but you could still identify each individual application. So that's a really cool way of looking at something else than just research and using it more for your operational needs. Okay, user rights. User rights, I usually start with roles, because if you messed with user rights in the past, you probably have messed with individual user rights before. So however, roles are really useful for managing large sets of users where you don't want to go back and forth and adding people and deleting people. So user roles are created in a similar way that you would add a user. Instead of adding a user, you just create a role, set up all the privileges for that, and then start adding people to that role. So roles are editable. If you want to edit it after 2 months, saying like, oh no, I don't want people to have this type of access, you can do that, and that will automatically populate for all the people in that role. However, if you're removing users from a role, it doesn't remove it from the project outright, it just removes it from that role, but it's still, that person still keeps the same user rights. So if you then want to delete that person from your project, you would have to go into its individual user right menu and click delete person. Similar with expiration dates, that's you cannot set that up per role because that would be weird. You have to set that up per user. Some user roles that I've seen a lot, and that's really useful, are user control, which is usually the 1 or 2 persons in a project that have the keys to the castle, so to speak, that manage who has access to what. If you give that to everybody, everybody can change their own rights, can mess with things, and that's kind of defeating the purpose of user rights. So if you have 1 or 2 persons that safeguard that, you can actually tell the IRB and other people that want to know, saying, okay, yeah, this person is responsible for that. So if something goes wrong, you need to talk to him or her. So that's the thing. However, it has happened that people leave your project and their position, and that they forget to transfer their user right or their user control role to somebody else. If that happens, shoot me an email, I can fix that. A second one is design control. This is usually reserved for people that either the PI or somebody who designed the project that can add variables, remove them, change options. You, again, don't want to give that to just anybody, especially if you don't know the implications that well. Data entry speaks for itself. These are people that have fairly limited rights. The only right they have is basically, okay, you get to enter data and nothing more. Usually these people don't have any export rights, they don't have any data quality rights. The only thing they would be able to do is enter data and maybe edit existing records to update data. Then an even more limited one is a reviewer. A reviewer doesn't even have the rights to edit data. He only has the rights to view data. So really useful if you, for instance, have somebody that you're collaborating with and say, okay, can I audit your data set? So, sure, here's a reviewer role. Knock yourself out. So that's useful. Research coordinator is kind of the odd duck out because they usually are similar to data entry. However, they need a little bit more power. For instance, if they're running the surveys or if they need to export data and analyze it for reports. So that's kind of handy to have, give them a little bit more user rights. How you tweak that is up to your project. So however, I've seen this one a lot. And then the project manager PI role. This is also one that has a lot of variability in it. Some people don't want their PI to mess too much with their project. They just want them to see what they're doing and they can keep an eye on things. Where other PIs are super involved and want to have a handle on everything and make changes themselves. So either those two ends of the spectrum or anything in between can be a project manager or PI role. I usually let that depend on the proficiency of the person in question in terms of REDCap. And then the final one, which a lot of people don't use, but I highly recommend you do, is the statistician role. The only thing that the statistician role should be able to do is export all the data. The reason why is that if the statistician comes to you, for instance, say like, hey, give me your data set because I need to analyze it. Give me the latest version. What you're going to do, or what most people do is, okay, I'm going to export it, have a nice little set of documents there, and email that to that person and be done with it. However, that's horribly insecure because email is usually not encrypted. So as a result, you're kind of violating HIPAA at that point because you're sending personal health information over the internet unencrypted. Big HIPAA no-no. So if you give somebody access as a statistician and say, okay, the only thing you can do is export all the data, whether in an identified data set or de-identified, that's up to you. This will give them a direct, secure, and encrypted link into your data set that they can use whenever they want. If they need a new data set, they won't bug you for it because they can just go in and grab it themselves. It also gives them the advantage of selecting what the format is that they want. So highly recommend that you build a statistician role in there, especially if you're using one. That way you're not violating HIPAA, they bug you less, and they can do whatever they want with their own data set. So everybody wins. Make sense? Cool. So some best practices for basic application access. Limit people to only the rights they need, not the ones they might want. That's just common sense, but I mention it because not everybody uses that common sense. Keep somebody's role in mind, so if you're only expecting somebody to do data entry, only give them the things they need to do data entry. Options depend on active features. For instance, if you're not using randomization, why would you give somebody randomization rights, right? And take special care with project design, user rights, the data export tool, and the data import tool. Project design, for similar reasons that I mentioned, if somebody can mess with your project, they could potentially muck it up, which would be bad. User rights is the equivalent of giving somebody the keys to the castle so they can change anything they want, including giving themselves project design rights. Data export tool you need to be careful with, mainly because once the data is out of REDCap, you cannot control it anymore via REDCap because it doesn't live there anymore. So once it's outside of REDCap, you become responsible for it. So if you give somebody access to export your data, you better be very sure that they're not going to mess with the data or basically email it directly to the nearest newspaper or outlet. Data import is kind of the opposite side of that coin. If you import a lot of data all at once, you can potentially overwrite existing data or basically mess up your data set and make it very messy. So that's also a thing to be aware of. Some form restrictions. A lot of people don't really use this, but you by default have access to all the forms within a REDCap project. However, you can also turn that off. So either give them only view rights or don't give them access at all. That way they won't even see it. So if you, for instance, have a single form with a lot of demographics in it and somebody doesn't need to know those demographics to do their job, give them no access to it. They can't even export it, they can't even see it, they won't even know it exists unless you tell them, like, we have a demographics form. So that would be the no access one. The read-only one is exactly what it means, read-only. View and edit is the default setting. There's also a fourth one for surveys, the edit survey responses. And this one is semi-independent. It's usually linked to the view and edit rights. because you can only have edit survey response rights if you have view and edit rights, obviously. This will allow you to open up a survey response and edit information in it. Really handy, for instance, if somebody says like, yeah, I put this email in, but I made a typo, or that email got hacked and I'm using a different one. Can you change it? So that's really handy to do that. And it's really useful for complex studies. That's usually where this gets used. Most people have access to everything. The fun bit about data access groups is that you can set them up independently from user rights. So you can have 5 different data access groups and have data entry people in all of them, or only have data entry people in one of them. So the main thing about data access groups is that users in a data access group can only see the records created by members or themselves of that same data access group. So if you, for instance, have a multiple site situation and you don't want the different sites to see each other's data, you put each of them in a separate data access group. The exception to that is people without a data access group. They can see everything. So that's, and they can also reassign people to different access groups. So this is usually very handy for data managers or people that have the overview of the entire project. I've seen it used for the different site example that I mentioned earlier, but also for double data entry. So let's say you have 2 groups that do the same entry, group A and group B. Just make 2 data access groups. They cannot see each other's work, so that's how it works. The thing, if you do double data entry with this, is you will probably need a second unique identifier, let's say a study ID, besides the normal record ID. So you can have 2 records with the same study ID. So if you decide to use data access groups and you already have like 30 or 40 projects of records in there, and you kind of want to assign all those records to a data access group, really easy to do. You can either use the import form, saying like, okay, for this record ID, I'm going to put it in this data access group, or you can go into the first form of a specific record, and on the top right-hand corner of that, you will see a drop-down with data access groups in it. Let me show you that. Let's do Chrome. There we go. So any given project, let's go to my records. Let's go to Mevrouw Lagarde. On the top right-hand side here, assign a record to a data access group. Click on that and you get a list of all the data access groups. You just say, this is Redmond, and you hit Save Record. It's that easy. Then now you assign that person to the data access group. Make sense to people? Cool. Okay. Oh yeah, forgot to tell that users can only export records in their own data access group, which is kind of implied. However, it actually works that way. Locking. So if you have a bigger project with a lot of moving parts and you have people validating other people's work, you might want to use locking. So locking allows people that have locking rights to lock down a specific form or an entire record and saying, okay, other people without locking rights cannot edit this anymore. They can view it, but they cannot edit it. So especially handy if you do data entry. Somebody validates it, that person that validates locks it, so the other data entry people cannot mess with it anymore, which basically causes it to be revalidated. So really useful to protect the verification work. So most people use this in combination with the unverified tag. So you basically tell your data entry people, once you complete the data entry, put the unverified tag on it so that the person that does the validation actually knows which ones to target and which ones to validate, so to speak. As always, e-signature does not work with the UDAP NetID system, so some people tried that and said like, hey, it's not working, why doesn't it work? So luckily you can uncouple that from the locking functionality. Also, e-signature is kind of annoying because if you were to turn that on, it would ask you every single time you lock a record to type in your password. And if you're like me and your password is 25 characters long, that gets old real quick. Okay, let's continue with study design then. So study design is a couple of tips and tricks I picked up on the way working on various projects. So I highly advise people to splitting up their forms in a couple of different situations. Sometimes you want a big form with all your data in it, sometimes you want to split it up. So it's really handy to split it up in development mode, mostly because it's easier to go through. So if you have a 200 variable form and you want to change variable 139, you have to scroll a lot, and that gets annoying quickly. So if you split it up in more sizable chunks, it's easier to just, oh, that wasn't that form. Go there, make the changes and do that. For longitudinal studies, splitting up forms is also highly recommended, mainly because you can mix and match different forms with different events, so you don't get unnecessary duplication. And if you want to test out or build any scoring tools, make a separate form for that. You can integrate them in existing forms. However, sometimes people get confused while they're doing data entry, saying, okay, where does the scoring tool begin and where does it end? So having separate forms helps remediate that. Some notes on that do contain the overview. You can also go overboard with the number of different forms. If you have 200 different forms, it kind of gets complex. And try to build forms around contained modules. So if you're collecting clinical measurements, BP, height, weight, that kind of stuff, put that in one form, but don't add medications to it. Make that another form. It does allow also for more frequent saving, because REDCap only saves your data when you move from form to form. So if you have 200 variables, you fill out the first 100 and your computer crashes, you lose that first 100 variable data. However, if you have multiple forms, every time you switch to a new page, it saves. So you save your work automatically that way. Flexibility in workflow design, which pertains to longitudinal studies mostly, and it's very easy to undo. So let's say after you're done in development mode, you say like, yeah, I have 20 forms, but I kind of want to cut it back to 4. You can merge forms fairly easily in the data dictionary if you know how. So. Variable names. So I see a lot of people making this mistake by creating very long variable names. By default, some statistical programs limit it to about 32 characters. So instead of saying like medication number 5 for follow-up visit, which is a very long thing, you can also shorten it a little bit. That still makes sense to people that are looking at the variable names, but isn't a super long string. This will help you with branching logic and with calculations, because if you have that long string, it's easier to make a typing mistake, a typo, and it just bugs the hell out of you if you have to type in really long variable names every time you want to do branching logic. So keep them short and consistent. Keep them lowercase. REDCap has this odd rule that you cannot start a variable with a number, so it has to start with a letter. So it's either lowercase, lowercase letters, numbers, or underscores. That's the only characters that are allowed. So no exclamation marks or question marks or hashtags or anything like that. Keep it decipherable for people that are going to work with the data, especially your statistician. Use codes for repeating variables, either shorthand, make them sequential and context-based. So a good example of that is, for instance, if you have a medication list with 10 medications, naming all 10 variables roughly the same makes a lot of sense. So in this case, medication number 1, in a follow-up, RX FU1. So FU stands for follow-up, not the other one. So if you have medication number 2 in the follow-up, RX FU2, etc., etc. So for most people that are in the medical profession, know that RX stands for medication, FU for follow-up is fairly easy to decipher, and number 1 in the one. So that way it's 5 characters instead of medication, number 1, follow-up, which is I think close to 20. So that's one example. Similar eligibility question number 4. Elig is usually enough to identify it. Q4, question 4. So that's, when you think about it, relatively easy to decipher for people. However, if you find it hard to create these shorthand codes, contact your statistician or somebody who's done this before. Trust me on this, all statisticians have preferences on this one. they have their own little coding systems or their own little preferences how they got taught on how to create variable names. So if you want to keep them happy, consult them before you start creating those. Record IDs. So the record ID is always the first variable in the first form. Some of you might have noticed this. Why is this the case? Well, it's used by REDCap to basically save all the variables under one record. So it always knows, okay, the first variable is the record ID. That doesn't change. It always has to be a text field with no validation on it. I highly recommend people to turn on auto numbering so you don't have to think about it. It just happens. And then create a secondary ID underneath there where you're going to put in your own study ID or MRN or whatever you want to put in there. That way you won't mess with REDCap's storage of your data, while at the same time giving you the flexibility to do your own study ID things. For instance, in double data entry, really handy. Yes, you will have group A and group B will have different record IDs. However, they will have the same study ID where you can merge them. If you do duplicate record IDs by, for instance, getting creative with arms and longitudinal modules, this will cause analysis errors because if you export it, it looks weird. And most statistical programs will throw you an error. In some cases, you do get export errors, especially if you have a complex project. It will cause backup errors for us, so try not to do that because we really don't like that. And it will screw up certain advanced features that rely on record ID. So the overall message on this one, I'll repeat again, do not duplicate record IDs. Form design, a little bit less macro view, a little bit more zooming in on individual forms. Try to design your variables as granular as possible. What I mean with that is, for instance, if you have age, you can capture somebody's age in different categories, like are you in the 25 to 35 group or 35 to 45 group. So if you do that, yes, you capture your data successfully. However, if you then 2 years down the road analyze your data and say like, I see something weird happening in the 25 to 35 group, I kind of want to split that out a little bit more. And if you only captured it in different categories, good luck figuring out what the exact age of somebody was. So it's always easier to go less granular from high detail to low detail than the other way around, because the other way around implies that you would have to go back to that person, ask them their age. And in certain cases, if you, for instance, collect blood pressure, you cannot even go back because, yeah, you don't know what their blood pressure was 2 years ago. So, yeah, always consider the smallest measurement unit. What I mean with that, in the age category, for instance, always goes with days or date of birth. BMI, yes, you can go for BMI, but split it out with height and weight too, so that way you always have that data. I had one person using blood pressure just for normal or abnormal, didn't even say it was like hypertension or hypotension, so always try to capture both the diastolic and the systolic in terms of blood pressure. So the overall is like, there's no such thing as too much data in my book. Raw value choice coding for multiple choice fields. So if you have a structured form like a drop-down or a radio button or a checkbox, you can potentially use whatever you want in there. You can call your raw label green 52 if you want. However, try to use a numeric value. They're easier to analyze. You can calculate with them and do statistical analysis on it easier. It allows for shorter logic, easier calculations. You have less chances of typos, and when you do that with a numeric value, always reserve room for additional choices. For instance, the classic example for that one would be, let's say you have 4 options that people can choose in the checkbox, and the 5th option saying like, I refuse to answer, or I don't know, or not applicable. So if you label them 1 through 5, totally valid, legal, you can do that. However, if you down the road want to add a 5th or a 6th option, then you would have label 1 through 4 be option, number 5 is I don't know, and the number 6 and 7 would be the 2 additional labels, which is kind of messy when you start analyzing it. So what I usually do is when I have like the outliers, I don't knows or not applicables, I code them with a significantly higher number, for instance 99 or 98, which is the statistical convention. This way you reserve room for additional choices if they become relevant down the road. Well, when using a non-numeric value, sometimes that does happen. Try to keep it short, avoid commas, because commas is the way that REDCap defines, okay, that's a separator between a raw value and an actual label. Do not include HTML tags. It will break the variable, so do not do that in raw values. You can use it in the label, but not in the raw values. And most people use it for piping of non-numeric values. For instance, classic example is like, which countries did you visit? So let's say you have 10 countries in Middle America, and you want to pipe that information. Oh, you visited Honduras and Belize. Instead of piping in the value 2 and 5, you want to actually pipe in Belize and Honduras in whatever you're doing there. So that would be a good reason to not use numeric values. However, when you do that, do realize that down the road, when you do your statistical analysis, you will need to convert those raw values into numbers. So when you're doing calculations, shorter is better, mainly because it's easier to debug. Also, less chance that something goes wrong. In Dutch, PEMDAS is something else. However, the same principle holds. Everybody that apparently had third grade math should know what PEMDAS means. Anybody here doesn't know what that means? PEMDAS is the order of operations in math. So parentheses first, then exponential multipliers, multiplication and division at that point, and then from left to right, and then addition and subtraction. So it's a little bridge so you remember what to do. So same thing applies to REDCap. REDCap follows the same normal math logic order of operators. So when you build something and you want something to calculate before it goes into the larger calculation, put it between parentheses. Easiest thing to remember. So because if you're using parentheses, and most of you are going to do that now, match up those parentheses. If you don't have an opening and a closing parentheses, your entire calculation is invalid, so it won't go. So it's kind of an issue. What I usually do is, when I'm not sure about the things, because I have like 20 of them in there and I can't really match them up, I copy the entire string in Excel, and Excel is really good at detecting that if there's enough parentheses everywhere. So that's a trick. Or any type of text processor usually does that too. For some of the advanced functions, and they've been adding advanced functions steadily over the last year or so, check the FAQ. There's things for summing up stuff, for rounding down. They actually added looking up a specific substring in a certain text. For instance, give me all the emails that end with @gmail.com. Very handy. So, so it does a contain thing, or start with, or end with. So there's a bunch of different things you can use in calculations to basically filter which values you want to use. However, calculations can only produce numbers or not a number, NaN. So why is this? Well, because it's a calculation. It would be really weird if you do a calculation and the result is green, or I don't know, butterfly. So it can only yield a number. So the output of your calculation always has to be a number. So it's easy enough to do this. For instance, if you do want to compare stuff, if this then that. So if this is green, then assign the value 1. If not, assign the value 0. That's an easy one, and that's valid. Up until last Saturday, calculations did not run automatically. What that means is that if you have, for instance, scoring calculations in a different form, and all the questions that are where the score is based on are in a survey, for instance, you would have to go to that specific form after the survey was filled out before that would calculate. They fixed that, so that's not the case anymore. However, some people still ask me about it. It's really handy if you, for instance, want to hide that score from your survey takers, but still wanted to calculate automatically so you can use it in your analysis. So that's since version 6.4. So some calculations can produce an outcome without all the variables filled out. If you have a very simple calculation, just like sum up variable 1, 2, and 3, it will only calculate when all 3 variables are filled out. Kind of annoying. However, if you use logic, for instance, if variable 1 is not empty, use 1. If it is empty, use 0. It does calculate properly when you fill out, actually before you start filling anything out, because that's how you can do that. So if you want to have an intermediate score when people are filling it out, basically a running tally, use the if-then statements. I mentioned that Excel should be used for quick troubleshooting. Cascading calculations. It is allowed but not advised, mostly because you're going to have multiple calculations all over the place. If there's one mistake somewhere, you kind of have to go through the entire cascade to figure out what's wrong. There's no limit on the length of a calculation, so it kind of goes against the keep it simple, but if you want to prevent cascading calculations, try to use basically write it out, the entire calculation. So an example of a cascading calculation would be calculation 1 is variable 1 plus variable 2, and then calculation 2 would be the result of calculation 1 plus variable 3. So then, that's a fairly simple cascade. You could probably get away with that one. However, if the calculation 3 gets a little bit more complex, saying like, oh, only if calculation 2 is smaller than variable 4, then it should be variable 3 instead of variable 5. So that gets a little bit more complex. So at that point, you might want to ask, like, okay, what's exactly the thing I want to calculate? Should I calculate this within REDCap, or just wait until I'm analyzing it and basically do the calculations in the program that was designed to do that? So that's a word of warning. Okay, branching logic. Again, keep it short, easier to debug. Put parentheses around everything. That's my thing. Especially when it doesn't work exactly the way you want it to work, which happens a lot if you start mixing matching ands and ors together. So just put parentheses about only ors or only ands. In branching logic, you can also use Java functions, the same as in calculations. However, the difference from calculations is calculations always have to yield a number. Branching logic always has to end in a true or false statement. So you can, for instance, use like, if this is 0, then that or this, but then you always have to have a comparator operator in there. So equals to 0, then that's true. Great, equals to 1, then it's false. So that's a thing you need to be careful with branching logic when you're using functions like that. Make use of nested if statements, works really well. If this is the case, then go to another if. So if the color is green, check then if it's a tree, check then if it's this type of tree, if. And again, parentheses is important, that one, because that function only operates if you also put a closing parentheses around it. But you can use nested if statements that way. Try to keep your logic local. What I mean with that is that try to keep your logic within the same form. So if you are referencing other variables in other forms, you can do that. However, the danger for mistakes or errors creeps up quite a bit, because people change the other variables in other forms, and if it's all local, then it's easier to debug, because you clearly can see the relationship between, oh, that question belongs to that one. However, it is allowed. Be aware of the radio buttons versus checkbox conundrum. Radio buttons store data as a single value, because you can only select a single value. Checkboxes store all their data as individual variables. So if you have 10 options in checkboxes, you will get 10 variables as an output, and the only thing they say is, okay, this checkbox was checked yes or no, so 1 or 0. And that translates back to branching logic in this syntax. So radio buttons would be variable 1 is 1, and if it's a checkbox, it would be variable 1, option 1 equals 1, in this case checked. So why is this dangerous? Well, if you change your radio button to a checkbox or the other way around, you also need to think about all your branching logic that's dependent on that variable, because if there is any logic that's dependent on that, you will need to update that. Otherwise, the logic won't work. You get this annoying error message like, okay, this branching logic error exists, please fix it. So, and that usually results in people calling me, I don't know what I did wrong. So that's a thing that you would need to do. So be aware of that. Diagram your logic is a really helpful tool, especially if you have trouble basically conceptualizing a larger branching logic statement. And cascade your logic when possible. So cascading means having a short branching logic statement be dependent on another variable that's also dependent on another variable. So I have an example of that later on. This is different from calculations where cascading is kind of bad, but with branching logic it actually gets quite useful quickly. Diagramming. This is a fairly complex logic statement that I've drawn out. So if you look at it, it always begins with an if statement. If a certain variable is true, then go to this block of statements. If it's false, go to the other one. And then within that block of statements, you can do it's either that or this and that, similar for this one. So this is fairly easy to comprehend, right? It's nice and drawn out, and you can actually see which side you want to go. However, if you actually go to the actual syntax, it's this. It's a little bit harder to understand for most people. Even when you split it out in the programmer way, like this, it's still hard to understand for people. So if you have trouble with this, or if you are making a complex branching logic statement, just take a napkin, piece of paper, or do it in Excel or PowerPoint, and diagram your logic. It will make debugging easier because you can say, okay, this element is responsible for this, so it should do that. It helps tremendously. So does this make sense to everybody? Cool. Okay, the variable is empty trick. I use this a lot for cascading logic or delaying a field until certain variables are filled out. So let's say you have a survey and you say, okay, you can only continue when you give me your email. So you then build an email field with the email validation and all the logic dependent on that, like okay, only show this if that field is filled out. That way people can focus only on that email field and not, oh, I'm going to do that later on. No, they have to fill it out. So the syntax for that is really easy. It's just two arrows facing away from each other, and two single parentheses or single quotation marks or two double quotation marks. So there's no space in between. If there's a space in between, REDCap actually checks if that field just contains a space. So if it's empty, if there's nothing in between, you can say, okay, check if it's empty. So really useful trick. Yeah, double quotes do work. However, I've noticed people that are using the data dictionary in Excel. Excel uses double quotes for its own syntax. So if you export it, Excel interprets that and might mess it up. So single quotes work, double quotes work. However, be aware of the Excel trap in that sense. Okay. Cascading logic. Promised it before. For instance, medication lists. So medication lists are similar to adverse events, is you don't know how many medications people are going to have at any given point in time, but you do want to capture them all, or at least have room to capture them all. But at the same time, you want to keep your forms and your surveys short and succinct. So how do you deal with that? So what I usually do is, let's say you have, in this case, 6 options for medications. In the very first medication 1 will always display because people have to start somewhere. However, medication 2 will only appear when medication 1 has been filled out or has something in it. So, and that's what this logic is. So this logic will say medication 1 is not empty, display medication 2. So you always have a list of all the medications plus one empty one, which is really useful because people can have exactly enough room to fill out all their stuff without making a super long list. With 6 medications, you could probably get away not doing that, but I've seen projects where you have 20 medications or 25, which is a really long list on your screen. So in this cascades because medication 3 will only display when medication 2 has been filled out, but medication 2 will only appear to be filled out when medication 1 is filled out. So that way you get a skip, and that's why I call it cascading logic. So really handy trick. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. Cross-event branching logic. So I mentioned it before, try to keep your logic local. However, sometimes you can't help it. You can have to refer to the age in the demographics field or the gender in the demographics field. So cross-event branching logic is always dependent on if a form is repeated and if you're in longitudinal mode. If you're not in longitudinal mode, in essence, your form won't be repeated. You can always refer back to age or gender fairly easily without having to use an event tag. However, if that is the case, you do need to do that because REDCap needs to know which event it needs to look in for that specific variable, because that variable can be repeated. So if you don't know what your event name is, you can always find that out in the Define My Events tab in REDCap. The very last column of that page will have a list of auto-generated event names that REDCap uses. It's usually in the form, let's say you name it baseline underscore arm underscore 1 if the baseline is in the first arm. You have a second baseline in arm 2, will be baseline underscore arm underscore 2. So it kind of it makes a logical assumption on how to name it, but yeah, you will need to be aware of that. So try to use it for all your logic and longitudinal studies, especially if you use cross-event logic. And how you would go about it is the syntax would be fairly easy. You would between brackets put the unique event name, event 1 for instance, and then without a space between the other bracket, just you do your normal logic that you would normally do. So that's how you define, okay, I need you to look at this event and this variable. You also need this syntax, for instance, if you're doing automatic surveys in a longitudinal project, because REDCap doesn't know which event to look at if you're just referring to the variable name. So you always need to refer by event in that sense. The hiding field best practice. So I don't like deleting fields, deleting data. I think that all data has its purpose, and if you're collecting it for the first part of your study but not for the second part, there was a reason why you probably were collecting it in the first part. So some people just want to delete it outright, which is your prerogative, and you can totally do that, but it's usually easier or quicker just to hide that variable for future records. So what I always do is create an impossible scenario that can never be true. For instance, the record ID is 9999 and 1. So record ID can only be one value, so that will never be true. However, most people get away with record ID is 9999 because they don't have that many records. Very simple. So this basically means that this field is hidden, but all the choices are kept in case of a multiple choice edit. Or yeah, all the text fields that you've entered are kept and they will be exported. So you can always go back, okay, why didn't we want that field in there? So yeah, that's my thing. It doesn't generate any data loss and will prevent you headaches later on if you do need it or do want to reinstate it. Make sense? Piping variables will allow you to display and only display the value that you've previously entered in a different variable. For instance, if you have somebody's first name filled out, you asked that in the very first survey, you can then use that and display it in other variables, other questions, either in field labels, survey invitations, confirmation emails. It's just a way, a lot of people use it to personalize various things, or if you want to feed the information that people entered back to them so they can double check it, really handy way. I, for instance, did that the other day. We had a follow-up survey saying, okay, what's your preferred method of contact, phone or email, and then behind phone and email, we put in their actual email and phone number, so they actually know, okay, you have my phone number. However, in this example, we're doing the first name bit, where we have somebody filled out the value John, and in the thank you message we say, thank you, John. People know that it's totally auto-generated, but they just like appreciate a little bit more. It becomes really apparent in invitations, because it circumvents spam filters to a certain degree, because most spam filters these days look for first name. So for instance, if I send something to my email account and it doesn't have my first name in it, its potential spam score goes up quite a bit. However, if it does have my first name, and dear boss, please fill out the survey, it actually assumes, okay, they know you, or they know at least your first name, so this is probably less likely to be spam from some Nigerian prince. So that's a way to get around spam filters, but it also has a psychological effect on people, saying, okay, they actually just, instead of a generic email, send me a tailored email or a customized email, even though it's totally a generic email. So I've noticed that it raises my completion rates by about 10%, so that's kind of nice. So mess with it. Yeah, it does put in the raw value in cases of choices and not the label, so that's kind of an issue, but yeah, you can get around that by creating the label or the raw value as the same as the label. Okay, surveys. Who here wants to work with surveys? Everybody, yay, that's usually the case. So there are 4 main ways of distributing surveys. Public links, which are just links that you can fill out multiple times, or through QR codes. Personalized invitations, similar to public links, you start with a record, however you send somebody an initial email. Automatic invitations, which you usually use to send follow-up survey invitations after they've created a record, and survey queues. As an added bonus, you can also fill out any survey as a normal user. So the difference between public and personal or slash automatic invitations. So public links are ideal for recruitment. They're initially anonymous, meaning that you can send out a public link and do a total anonymous survey. However, once you ask them what's your name, what's your email address, date of birth, it becomes less anonymous. So initially it's anonymous. This can be filled out multiple times by multiple people at the same time. And you can, and this link is auto-generated by REDCap, either for a short link, an embedded link, or if you know what a QR code is, one of those little 2D barcode thingies. REDCap has got the feature that you can generate those for any type of link, so you can put them on flyers or something that people can scan. However, the big if with public links is that they're only available for the first survey of each arm. The main reason for that is that record ID I mentioned earlier. So REDCap uses that record ID to create records. So as a result, you can only create a record through a survey if it's the survey for the very first form for the first arm. So this is something you need to remember, because sometimes people call me up saying like, okay, my first form is not a survey and I wanted to use the public link for my second survey, but it doesn't work for some reason. Well, that's the reason. Switching those around will fix that. So for personalized invitations and automatic invitations, you do need an email. Because you do need an email, it's inherently identified. In privacy land, there has been discussion about whether an email is a proper enough identifier. Some people say no, because other people can hack into your email and then impersonate you. Other people say yes, it is an identifier because you can trace it back to a person. And the camps are fairly divided on that one. However, for PHI information, I'm usually treating emails as an inherent identifier, because you have a way of tracing that person. And that brings us to traceable completion rates. If you do personalized invitations, you can see who filled it out. Same with automatic invitations. You can see who filled out the follow-up surveys and who didn't. So personalized invitations are also only available for the first survey of each arm. The automatic invitations are available for all the other follow-up surveys. So that's the difference between the two. Public surveys, best practices. This is stuff that I've noticed works really well. So be honest. basically. About time required is a very big one. Nothing is as annoying as saying, okay, this will only take you 5-6 minutes, and then it's a 45-minute survey. People get annoyed by that and will click out of your survey, and as a result you have either incomplete data or no data at all. Number of questions and number of possible follow-up questions. If you have only 5 questions but there's a bunch of branching logic underneath each of those questions, say okay, each question can have up to 10 different follow-up questions based on your answer. Be honest works really, really well. Be brief. If you have a large chunk of text that you want to put in a survey, try to keep it brief. People don't like to read. Universal truth. So they they will just like scan through and think, oh, this is not relevant. Put the most important information in the first and the last sentence because that's the ones that they actually do read when they scan. However, try to keep it short by default. Links are always an option. For instance, instead of having the entire study protocol spelled out for them, saying like, if you're interested in the entire study protocol, go to this link and then have it somewhere in a PDF form. So keep it simple is always a good one. So when you are able to collect emails for future follow-ups and multiple unique identifiers if the IRB will let you, this is always a good idea because there's nothing as annoying as having, for instance, twins and they have the same last name and you only collected the last name. So that's a thing. And for emails, that's just handy because I've seen it multiple times. People did not collect emails for an anonymous survey and then the PI halfway through the project decided, let's do follow-ups. So yeah, but we cannot do that because we don't have their email. There you go. If you want to monitor the response rate for your surveys, set up notifications. However, notifications come with a little bit of an extra tagline. If you send out a survey to 1,000 people and let's say 20% fills it out, that means that you get 200 notifications. So if you do that, more than happy to do that. Put either a little Outlook folder filter in there or an automatic mark as read or something like that. Otherwise you get a very full inbox really quickly. So, but kind of useful. Personalized invitations, best practices, validate emails beforehand. There's nothing as annoying if you have a list of 1,000 emails and 300 of them don't work. Monitor response rate's always a good one. Send reminders manually if you need it. We do have the capability in REDCap since 2 upgrades ago to put in automatic reminders, up to 5 reminders with a certain variable time length that you can set up. Feel free to use those automatic reminders or the nagging feature as I like to call it. But you can always send up manual reminders too after that. Make one user responsible for survey management. There's nothing as annoying as getting 2 different emails from the same project saying, please fill this out. Yeah, I just did that because, yeah, I just filled it out. Use participant identifiers when you can, because that's handy. And be prepared to deal with spam filters. The piping works really well for that, to get around that. Just craft it to make it less spammy. It sounds kind of tacky, but just be very clear about it. Try to use a normal letter style. Dear so-and-so, minimize spelling errors. That's what people look for, and grammar errors. And follow up with a subset of non-responders, mainly to ask them, why did you not respond to my email? Say, if they, for instance, yeah, I didn't get it, then that's a pretty sure bet that it got caught in a spam filter. Or they say, oh, I didn't have time. So, oh, why didn't you have time? Well, I didn't have an extra 45 minutes to spend on your survey. That's a trigger for you to say, oh, we might need to reduce our data set a little bit. So always a good idea, especially if you're going to send out multiple surveys, to basically follow up like, why did you not fill out my survey? Be careful with data access groups. The user that is filling out these surveys should not be part of the data access groups because these 2 things conflict and they haven't fixed it yet. So if somebody is a data access group, they could potentially export all the records anyway. So if you have somebody filling out data access groups and using servers at the same time, either use automatic invitations to automate it in a certain way, or have the data manager be responsible for sending out surveys. So, survey queue. Who here has worked with a survey queue before? Kinda, a little bit. So again, recently relatively new feature. It can be found in the online designer, and it's automatically populated by all the forms and all your events in the different arms. No email is required, which is a very big plus. So basically, it allows you to, looks a little bit like this, it allows you to daisy chain surveys together. So for instance, if you have 5 surveys, instead of having to send out a manual email to say, please fill out survey 3, you just want them to fill them out all in one go, you can use the survey queue to link them together. So this will shorten your branching logic or simplify it quite a bit, because the logic is then only need to define it for a single survey and not for each record or for each variable individually. So if you do this, it makes your life a lot easier. So there is a save and return option to the survey queue link, because the survey queue link is something that's unique to the record and doesn't expire. So people can always come back to their survey queue link saying, okay, are there any additional surveys I still need to fill out or I need to edit? Use the auto start feature. If you don't turn auto start on, and you can see the auto start, it's this little checkbox behind each survey queue, then people first get to see an overview of all the surveys they still need to fill out, and then they can click on whichever survey they want to fill out. If you use auto start, the next survey automatically starts, hence the auto start name. So you can use the survey queue to define paths based on participant input. For instance, a very simple one would be, let's say you have an initial survey, an end survey, but you also have a male and a female centric survey. So you don't want to send the females to the males and the other way around. So what you could do with survey queue is like, okay, based on gender, send them to either one or the other, and then come back to the end study for both of them. Yeah, this makes it really great to basically steer people through a workflow in your own project. You can get quite complex with that. So yeah, follow-up questions is also a good one for that. Split up forms for greater flexibility. So the survey queue will allow you to create individual chunks of surveys, kind of create a page-like structure, but you control which pages you show at which time. So it's really handy for complex studies and longitudinal studies. If you're in longitudinal mode, you will need to define the survey queue for each event and each arm individually. You cannot automatically say, okay, I set it up for my first event, I'm now going to assume that event 2 will copy that. No, you have to set it up for each event. Okay, automatic invites best practices. Again, diagram, draw a workflow map. Check your trigger logic. There's nothing as annoying saying like, oh, I thought that my logic was sound and then it didn't work for some reason. So test it out. Make sure you use the correct cross-event logic if you have longitudinal projects. Check your time delay, especially when you're testing and you set your time delay to 2 days and you say, why is it not working? Well, it's because you have to wait 2 days before the email comes. So set your time delay for a minute or so when you're testing, and then later on change it all to whatever time period you had in mind to begin with. Always do a test run. Again, be prepared to deal with spam filters. Set up a general from email for your study that multiple people can access. If you send out a survey to 1,000 people, and of those 1,000 people, 5% is confused for some reason, which usually happens, and your email is from the from email, you're going to get 50 emails with people being confused. If you're out of the country or you're sick or whatever, you're not available, those people will have to wait and probably won't fill out your survey if you don't respond promptly. So if you have a general email that multiple people can monitor, you kind of circumvent that, and you also don't give your email out to 1,000 people at the same time. Also handy. So you can use your secondary or tertiary email for this. Okay, well this is my fire and forget example, as I like to call it. So this was for a blood drive survey project I did. So we had an initial intake donation form, which was a public link that we just put on a flyer. The survey itself included an email field and a choice field. The choice was like, okay, what do you want to donate? Whole blood, white blood cells, or just plasma? So either choice A, B, or C would shunt them to one of these 3 follow-up forms. So which would send them, which wasn't a private invitation, it went through the survey queue. I need to fix that. So after they finished that, there was a time delay of I think 2 weeks or something where all of them got shunted to the same follow-up form, like did you have any adverse events, like any hematomas or something, in your arm or whatever you gave blood. So that's a fairly useful feature of still spreading it out, but then using the automatic survey invitations and the survey queue in conjunction to make a fully automated survey chain from start to finish. No physical person actually had to monitor this or manage this, because REDCap all did it for them. So especially, this is a simple one, but especially if you have a more complex workflow, you might want to diagram it out. Survey confirmation, not everybody knows about this because it's kind of hidden. It's found in the survey settings. All the way at the bottom, you need to tag the box saying like, yes, send out survey confirmation emails. At that point, you can craft your own message for an email address that they provided, or if they didn't provide an email address, they get an option at the end of the survey, like, do you want a confirmation email? You can actually add a file to that. I think 12 megabytes is the limit. However, you shouldn't make it bigger than 5, because most email clients will reject it if it's 12. So for instance, if you have a brochure about your study, handy to attach it. Confirmation emails are really handy to put in some information that people then can refer back to, for instance, a study website or something, so they don't have to hunt for it on the internet again. And most people these days kind of expect it when you fill out a survey that they get a confirmation email. So. Survey reminders, I mentioned it earlier, up to 5 reminders. Each reminder is auto-cancelled when the survey is actually filled out, so you can set up 5 reminders for everybody, but if you fill it out immediately, then your 5 reminders get cancelled. You fill it out after the 3rd reminder, then your 4th and 5th get cancelled, and you didn't fill it out, then you get all 6 emails, the initial one plus 5 reminders. So that's how it will work. So these are located in the automatic invitation setup window under Online Designer. So you'll see a little button saying enable reminders, just check it, and then you'll get options on the time delay. In the participant list itself and in any composed survey invitation pop-up. So you can set up basically reminders for all the emails you can send out with REDCap. Normally when you think about data integrity or the cleanliness of your data, most people do that in statistical programs. They have built-in features for that, that they can see, okay, how many missing variables do you have, which ones are out of range, that kind of stuff. So that's usually more preferable. However, some people also like to clean their data while they're collecting data. So at that point, REDCap has a couple features that I'd like to go over with you guys to see, okay, how do we basically create the most cleanliest data set of them all. So the very simple one is the validation of text fields. So let's say you want to capture emails, you have an email validation. Same for time, you have a time validation. Same for numbers. That's a very simple one. If people are outside of their range or they don't apply a proper email address, they get a mention to it, like, okay, fill in a proper thing. So that's an easy one. Required fields are another easy one, saying like if you don't fill it out, then you have missing data. You don't want that, make all your fields required, they have to fill it out. Problem solved. However, that might not be ideal because, for instance, I personally don't have a middle name, but if you make middle name required, I have to fill something out in there. That doesn't make sense. So that's an issue. So some of the more advanced features for that is the data quality rule field. It's where you can run rules on your entire data set. For instance, give me all the missing data, or give me all the males that are pregnant. Should be 0, the last one. Then we also have the field comment log, which is enabled by default. This is allows you to comment on any variable in any record for whatever reason you want, and that's time-stamped. So let's say you have somebody that is doing a survey into, or doing a project into homelessness population. Somebody gives them, okay, what's your best contact info, and you don't really trust that. You don't want to create another field to say, okay, I don't really trust this. You just want to make a quick comment about it, saying, okay, we might need to check this guy out because I don't know if this is kosher. Data resolution workflows, that same thing, however on steroids, because you can open up issues and close issues based on what you think is appropriate and assign them to other users. More about that later. And then finally, if you do double data entry, you can use the data comparison tool, which allows you to compare two records together. And REDCap will only show you the fields that are different from each other. So let's say you have 500 fields. You don't want to show all 500 fields and hunt for the ones that are different. Now let's say 10 of those are different. It will only show you the 10 fields. So really handy if you quickly want to do a one-on-one comparison for data entry. So data quality. So it's found in the application list. It's a specific user right, so you do need to have user rights for that. If you don't see it in the list, you probably don't have the user rights. There are a couple pre-baked rules, missing values, validation errors, that kind of stuff. But you can also create your own custom rules. The custom rules are used, you use the similar syntax as branching logic. And a really cool thing about this is that you can real-time execute them. For instance, if you don't want a specific combination of answers because it's not in the protocol or it's impossible, you can create a custom data quality rule, turn on real-time execution, and once people hit save on that particular form where that's relevant and they violate the rule, they get a pop-up saying like, you're violating this rule, please change it, and they cannot continue. So kind of handy if you have a rule like that. So an example of that, for instance, the pregnant male, give me all the people that are males and are pregnant, should be 0, or if you put it as a real-time execution, it's like, hey, this is not possible, why did you fill this out? Let's see, make sense? Test it out, it's really handy, especially if you have a lot of records. Also, if you run a rule and it says you have 100 instances where this is an issue, you can click on that 100 number and it will give you a list of all the records with direct links to those records where that's an issue, so you can fix it. Data queries. This is similar to this is the data resolution workflow thing I talked about earlier. It's a crossover from clinical trial management systems because they found that really handy. It manages the quality of your data because you can open up issues and assign it to other people if you have the data resolution workflow open. So you can change this by 3 options. So by default, you have the field comment log with the comment ability. You can also turn it off. So if you don't want people to comment or open issues, you can do that. And if you want to beef it up, turn on data resolution workflow. And this is compatible with the data quality rules. They actually work independently of each other, so that's kind of nice. Field comment logs, you can access each comment by clicking on the text balloon next to the variable name. You can add as many comments as you want, so if you want to comment on a specific variable and then you see it 2 days later, you can leave another comment, and then you can leave another comment. As many comments as you want, everything is timestamped. And it works also together with the history widget. So if you look at this, for instance, that's where the little text balloon is. I don't know if it's clear for you guys. It's kind of vague. The little H above it is the history widget, which tells you, okay, who changed what at what point in time. So these two in conjunction will probably give you a pretty good overview of what happened with that variable. So kind of handy. There's also a log that you can do. If you comment on a field, it gets added to a master list. So which is really handy, for instance, if you have a weekly meeting that says, okay, what are all the issues that came up in data entry this week? You just print out the list and you go over it. Or you put it on a projector and you go over it. This is exportable CSV. You can put filters in there saying only give me the ones that are for this user. So how many comments did you make? Why did you make so many comments, for instance? And it also has direct links to each comment. For instance, if you look here, click on the one, it takes you directly to that form in that record. Well, we went over this. The only thing that you would need to remember is that once you enable data resolution workflow, you will also need to assign proper user rights to each of your users, because there is a fairly large degree of different user rights. Well, possible actions, opening issues, verifying data, responding to issues. Look through this at your own leisure. Data resolution workflow, similar to field comments, also has an overview. Works similarly, direct links, filterings, exports, the whole 9 yards. It also has an additional tab for metrics. So you can see how many issues were fixed within a certain amount of time, how many were opened, so you can get really quality control on your project. So that was my spiel for best practices. I will email you guys the slides later on if you sign in. If you have any other questions, feel free to stay after class. Otherwise, I thank you for your attention, and maybe until the next class.